Hello, welcome to this ESA Queensland webinar. I'm Gene Tunney, I'm the President of ESA Queensland. Today's presentation is by Dr. Cameron Murray of Fresh Economic Thinking, and he's speaking on what can we learn from Auckland's upzoning experiment. This is highly policy relevant given the ongoing housing affordability crisis we have here in Australia and in other advanced economies, and the debate over the extent to which reforms to zoning, to planning can help boost supply and improve affordability. Cameron Murray is an economist specialising in housing markets. He has a PhD from University of Queensland, and he's well known for his careful empirical work and for critically examining widely accepted policy claims. It's always good to hear from Cam for his perspective. As I mentioned, he runs Fresh Economic Thinking. That's a Substack newsletter and a podcast. So if you like what Cam has to say, check those out. Also, he runs workshops on real estate, on property economics, and I'll put a link to something he's got coming up in the notes. Please note that this recording begins after the webinar started, so you just missed a brief introduction. You haven't missed any of the substance, but just please note that, so that explains why it begins a bit abruptly. Okay, I hope you find this presentation informative and thought-provoking. Thank you.
We're coming up to 10 years on, and there's been a series of papers looking at the effect on rents, on the rate of housing production, on all sorts of things. And I guess what I want to do is really test whether those extremely bold claims about the economic effects hold up. And I'm going to go through a series of those papers and really sense check them and unpick them, because the bold claims, like anything, will circulate around the internet and make it to, for example, the British Columbia Parliament in Canada, who's informing their regulations there. It makes it all around the world, but I think we have to understand what happened. And the overall lesson here is be very cautious about the most bold claims about this experiment, and remember what we should expect from simple economics. So the zoning change that attracted all this attention, it's called the Auckland Unitary Plan, which was implemented at the end of 2016. And what makes it interesting is that a huge swathe of the city, 75%, was changed from detached housing zone only to allow duplexes and townhouses and things like that. So when we talk about in terms of zone capacity, like theoretically how many new homes could be built based on the existing planning rules, instead of 37 years worth of additional production already sort of available in the scope of the plan, it boosted it to 100 years. And of course, we know no one knows what the population of Auckland is going to be in 100 years, but 100 years at the current rate of housing production to use up all those extra sort of spaces created. What happened? We know the share of attached housing, new attached housing, grew. So, of course, from redevelopment of attached housing to townhouses. We know that the average new dwelling got smaller, much smaller in Auckland relative to the rest of New Zealand in the 6 or 7 years that followed. We know there was a construction boom. We know rent growth was slower than the rest of New Zealand. So, these housing market changes oopsie daisy, I'm just trying to move this, are reported to be very large. For example, there are some papers that suggest the housing production, the rate per year of new housing, doubled for more than half a decade. That led to 5% more stock. So out of the 500,000 homes, 25,000 or more extra homes. And that rents declined by more than a quarter and up to a third, depending on the specification of the analysis, in just a few years. So it sounds like at the headline level that this is a mission accomplished story for affordable housing, and that's why it's sort of taken on this meme-like quality. And so I really want to just check in and say, should we be more cautious? To summarize the rate of production or how the housing market um, evolved in Auckland, this is a sort of data dense chart, but the blue line is dwelling consents, which are the equivalent in Australia of building approvals. So they're not planning approvals, which are called resource consents in New Zealand. They are, building approvals. And you can see what you'd expect, a rising rate of consents from the early 2010s up till COVID. And then if you shift forward a couple of years, you can see in the yellow the number of new homes completed rising, but not quite getting as high. But the interesting context here also is the red line is net new residential electricity connections. So what that's counting is how many extra residential dwellings are connected to the power network. And so we can sort of think of the gap between that and the yellow as net demolitions. And so we can see that shaded yellow area that new housing after this AUP upzone started involving more demolitions per new dwelling as well. And so we see this big rise in consents, but a much more subdued sort of boom in net additions. The other important context to unpick, the net effects here is that New Zealand had a very low population growth sort of from before the financial crisis all the way up to 2013. And then it suddenly more than doubled for a few years, right into when the Auckland Unitary Plan, the AUP here at the end of 2016, was enacted. So um, Auckland is by far the biggest urban area in New Zealand. There's 5 million people roughly in New Zealand. I'm going to just go off the ballpark, 1.5 in Auckland. So it's sort of the biggest agglomeration. And so when you compare to places like Australia, we sort of had stable population growth, but they had this massive shock to population growth right at this time. So of course, we're going to expect more new housing in Auckland ramping up during this period regardless, which makes understanding the counterfactual and isolating policy effects very difficult. But people have tried, and there's sort of 6 papers and results that I want to go through and with a sort of careful eye to see really what happened and the way the changes in the market have been framed. So there's a paper here from 2021 that sort of asks the question, did this change reduce the price of existing dwellings? Because if you expected future prices to be lower because of new supply, asset markets will incorporate those expectations immediately into the current price. So this paper looked at repeat sales of upzoned and non-upzoned areas within the region, and they found that, intensively developed properties decrease in value relative to similar dwellings that were not upzoned, showing that large-scale upzoning had an immediate depreciative effect on pre-existing intensive housing. This was the headline result. It was in the abstract. It was in all the press about it. But the issue here is that it's a misleading way to present what happened. In fact, this paper finds that 99% of upzoned homes appreciate in value on average, because all of that 75% of the land area, those existing detached homes, you're now able to subdivide into townhouses. And only a tiny fraction of upzoned homes depreciated by an average of 1% over the study period, which is about 4 years. And non-upzoned appreciated still by 67%. So what's really interesting is that there's almost no data in the range of intensively developed properties that were upzoned that apparently decreased in value. If I look at the data here, what they're doing is they're taking on the x-axis the intensity ratio of development, which is the ratio of the capital value of the building divided by the total value. So if it's all building value and no land value, you get 1. And what happens is you get this negative relationship that the more intense, the price change and on the y-axis is the average annual price growth compared to the non-up zone. And you see, well, most of it increased in value, but the intensively developed ones decreased. Right. So that's the finding that was highlighted. The problem, of course, there's almost no data in this side of the data set. All of the data is in the increase in price side. And I kind of use this chart to illustrate all the data's up here, right? The mean intensity ratio is less than a half, I believe. And almost none of it's up here. So this blue line I've drawn of a curve is an equally valid specification for this type of modeling exercise. But because we've got a line and we've extended it past the data, we sort of are highlighting this negative price effect it's not really there. So this is just an example of how the data's out there of what happened, but there's a lot of sort of interpretation questions and highlighting things that I think we need to be cautious about. Right, so upzoning increases pretty much all property value. The headline of this result was intensively developed properties decrease in value. So that's a little bit not quite what you'd expect. Can you hear a saw? Someone's just started using a power saw outside my window. I hope the microphone's okay. Okay, he's moved. So firstly, does upzoning reduce the price of existing homes? Good question. No, not really, because you're offering an additional future return for those property buyers who buy those homes who can now subdivide it to townhouses. But the interesting sort of question is, well, let's put the pricing to one side. Does it increase the rate of housing construction? Because all the mechanism by which we might assume that zoning changes the price and rents of housing is via a quantity effect. So can we see it? There's another paper here. There was an early working paper. It's in the Journal of Urban Economics, and it looked at upzone area consents, so these are building approvals, compared to non-upzone areas, and then adjusted for some spillovers, which are substitutions between areas. Because of course, if you upzone one area and not across the road, maybe those people across the road wait and don't develop because there's all this new stuff competing with them. The main finding here is that 21,000 additional dwellings were permitted in 5 years. This is a place that permitted less than 10,000 per year the previous 5 years, right? And so in 5 years, it's estimated that 4.1% of the dwelling stock, so an additional 4.1 of the whole stock of 500,000 dwellings, so 25% of permits in those years. What are the issues here? Well, I mean, this sounds really good to me, and geez, I'd love it if this were true, that we could just increase the stock of homes by 4.1% in 5 years. But there's a few artifacts in this data. First is the sample excludes some substitution areas to create a structural break that's not really there in the overall urban trend. Secondly, there's a sort of straight line counterfactual. And thirdly, as we saw in the chart at the beginning with the blue line with consents, the yellow line with completions, and the red line with net additions have been much, much lower than consents in that 5 years. And that's changed from before the upzoning, where a larger proportion of consents turned into net additional dwellings. So you might have seen this chart in, I'm going to elaborate on the biased sample. You might have seen this chart in the Financial Review. It looks really good. And do you know what? When I hadn't even really paid a huge amount of attention to this paper until I saw this chart, and I thought, okay, it works. I'm convinced. What a convincing chart. You basically upzone, and then you get this skyrocketing effect. The data issue is this. That's not the whole city. The full data includes all these grey areas that are excluded from the analysis. And because areas within the same urban region are substitutes for each other, you can't just look at the substitution between the orange and blue. You have to look at the substitution between the grey and blue as well. And so when you exclude these data, you get a real kink in the total amount of dwellings in the city. But if you keep all the dwelling consents in the region in, you basically get a smooth curve all the way through, right? And what we'd be looking for in this type of chart would be some kind of recognizable change in the slope of that curve right around this implementation time. It's just not quite there. So the authors did include some of this data in another paper, but it's quite interesting. There are a few issues with that because we look at the curve before and after we include this data. They also shifted the implementation time to what says first announcement because there was another partial upzoning. Are the colors the right way around? No, that label should say upzoned in blue. Thank you. There was another earlier upzoning, and so when they included the extra data in a later paper, they also shifted the date, the implementation date, back to 2013. So they're now extrapolating this 3-year straight line, okay, and looking for a kink for the next 5 or 6 years. And you can sort of see, what it looks like here. If it were true that there were 22,000 additional homes, okay, their assumption in this paper is that consents would have looked like this black line, and then suddenly in 2016 looked like this orange line, okay, which is just a slight adjustment to this straight line approximation of the pink line. So they're sort of assuming in the counterfactual that suddenly, despite, remember, that doubling of population growth in New Zealand from 2013 to 15, that suddenly the rate of growth of consents would fall dramatically. I don't know if that's the right counterfactual, and to me that means that 22,000 cumulative gap there between what was done and what was assumed as a counterfactual seems quite overestimated to me. I talked about the issue of consents not being completions and not being net additions, but the other sort of issue I raised at the start of looking at this is this idea that we're extrapolating a straight line trend from the pre-treatment period. And if you look at the pre-treatment period, and this is for an extended version that shifted the treatment to 2013, it doesn't really look like a straight line, right? It looks like you're having this huge exponential rate of growth, right? Because you're responding to this population surge. And so if you put an exponential trend in here, it totally changes the result. So, are the results meaningful? Hard to say. Do they look a lot like the cyclical growth that was seen in many other cities during the same period? Yeah, it kind of does. Now, I'm not saying there's no effect from this, but what I'm saying is 4.4% of the total stock seems like it's out by, an order of magnitude potentially. Oh, again, remember, we're treating in this analysis consents, building approvals, as additions to the stock of homes to make the claim that there's 4% extra homes. But actually, the consents rose all the way up to nearly 20,000 per year, but completions have never really risen past 12 or 13,000, even accounting for delays. And so what you see here is this rising gap between consents 2 years prior, so 100 would be 100% of consents 2 years prior convert into new housing. The yellow line here is what proportion of those become new dwellings, and the blue line here is what proportion of those are net new dwellings accounting for demolished homes. Because if you're now doing a lot of townhouses, you're subdividing one home into 4 homes, or one into 3, or one into 5. And that sort of thing is happening. So that gap between these two lines has been rising, apart from a few periods where there was a bit of a pause on construction activity. So the authors have done other methods to ask the same question, because it really is the most important question: what really happened in Auckland? Did we really get 20 something thousand additional dwellings. So they used another method called synthetic control, which essentially is like a linear regression of the before treatment. And you compare basically which other regions in New Zealand help you predict the number of consents in Auckland in the pre-treatment period, and then you just multiply those coefficients by the number of consents in those other regions to calculate a counterfactual Auckland. The synthetic control is a bit nifty in that you don't allow for negative coefficients in this, so you can't really have substitute regions. So, if you could compare Brisbane and the Gold Coast, you might say, well, when there's more building approvals in Brisbane, there's less on the Gold Coast because people are moving from the Gold Coast to Brisbane. So there should be a negative relationship. Now, the synthetic control forces you not to have that. It just forces you to have a weighted positive sum of other regions as your sort of counterfactual Auckland. So when you do that, you find that apparently 6 years on from the reform, cumulative permits exceeded those of the synthetic control by 43,500, which is nearly half of the 47,000 permits issued since the Unitary Plan began. So can you guys just sleep at night? Thanks. Sorry, getting a lot of action here. What's the problem? Well, the counterfactual here is even more unrealistic than the previous method, which essentially assumed the growth rate in dwelling consents would suddenly stop at the time of the rezoning, would suddenly stop growing at whatever percent and start growing a lot more slowly. So let's have a look at that. So this is an even bigger claim, right, of the quantity effect. In the actual Auckland, we have this black line, which is the same as the one I showed before, which is the big decline before the financial crisis, and then a massive, massive boom from 2013 when population growth rate doubled all the way up to the early 2020s. And the synthetic control is this sort of weighted sum of other regions in New Zealand. And you can see, it does match pretty well before the Unitary Plan, which is this pink line, but then it also suddenly drops. Again, the counterfactual is Auckland would have suddenly sort of approved fewer new homes, but for this plan, despite the couple of years of rising population growth. Now, what's interesting is the synthetic control is 50 to 80% of Tauranga, which is a population 150,000, right? So Auckland's nearly 10 times bigger, and Kapiti, which has a population of 60,000. And they're also sort of small nearby regional areas. So the question really is, well, is it plausible? Yes, your method finds that if you do a weighted sum of these two small regions for a bunch of years before the treatment, it seems to match. But do we really believe it's plausible that because Tauranga had a sudden decline in dwelling consents that Auckland would have too, to use that as our control? And this is what that control looks like. It's just the weighted sum of these regions. So it's 57% Tauranga and 21% Kapiti Coast. You could actually get rid of Hamilton and Wellington. And, do we really believe that that's 60,000 person sort of regional holiday area is good to help us predict for what happens in Auckland during a, historical population surge? I'm not so sure. And what's also, of course, interesting is that Wellington really did have. So if you had 100% Wellington in your sort of counterfactual, you'll see that if I re-weight an index of dwellings consented for the two cities at the time of the upzoning, you get a similar continuation of the surge. So perhaps New Zealand's two biggest regions were accommodating this population growth in similar ways, during that surge in the 2010s. So, a bit of context is needed. And so I think for me, I find it hard to believe this synthetic control and that there's 43,000 extra dwellings in Auckland. We need to sort of condition that on what the method found and whether it's reasonable. So what about rents? If you believe the results so far, then you should be primed to be pretty clear that there should be a big rental effect because you've added 43,000 dwellings in 5 years, which is 4% of the housing stock. You've nearly doubled the rate of housing production. You've decreased prices. So, of course, it would be weird to find that rents have gone up. And, of course, this paper here finds that rents went down using the same synthetic control method fitted to pre-unitary plan or pre-upzoning trends. The results here are this. 6 years on from the reform, the synthetic control from our preferred empirical specification implies that rents would have been 28% higher under the counterfactual, which means rents fell 35% from what they would have been otherwise when you take the inverse proportion. So we're sort of saying, wow, this reduced rents by a third in Auckland. That's quite a lot for 4% over 5 years. But if we're to believe the previous results and take them at face value, maybe it seems plausible. The sense check on this one, as well as getting similar weighting for the counterfactual rent in the synthetic control and having just a couple of small towns. The question really is, what should we expect rents to do in a market that's connected spatially where people can move between them? And if we look at the chart for the last 30 years in New Zealand, we can see that Auckland in blue, Wellington in yellow, and Canterbury, the three largest urban regions, the rents do diverge from time to time. But as you'd expect, they sort of track pretty well, meaning the relative quality of life difference between these cities doesn't sort of diverge too much, because if it did, people would switch cities, right? And so that moving margin sort of keeps that spatial equilibrium in check. The biggest city can't just be twice as expensive, or people will move out of it to the other regions, and of course it can't be half as expensive either. And so rents would be 35% higher in the Auckland under the counterfactual of no reform. That's actually the main result. They actually tempered that and said, we like this other specification that gives a lower result. And the light blue is what they're saying without the upzoning, Auckland rents would have looked like. They would have suddenly totally moved out of kilter with other towns. They'd moved totally out of kilter with other towns. Good question, Pete. I'll get to that at the end. Which has never happened before. And every time Auckland previously had diverged from other towns, it had converged again. Right? And of course, if Auckland rents were 35% higher than all the neighbouring areas, you'd get fewer people moving there, and spatial equilibrium would return. So the question really is, well, is there a true net effect? Or have we just changed the location of where things are built and where people move to? That's, I think, the interesting question. So we've got this sort of story, a lot of evidence showing, wow, huge, major effects on the quantity supplied. We've got some methodological issues and some caution because consents aren't net additional dwellings. We've got the population surge that was going to be accommodated somehow, somewhere. We've got spatial equilibrium suggesting, usually rents don't diverge that much between neighbouring areas where people are mobile. So another question that's been asked about New Zealand is, well, what about public housing? Maybe upzoning allows us to build more public housing. So again, a similar method, synthetic control, which is just like sort of grab all your data, let the algorithm minimize the errors and ensure that the positive weights all add up to 1. But we'll look at the number of public housing consents in different areas of New Zealand. And in this case, it's quite interesting because they reckon that 7,000 permits, or 2/3 of total public housing permits in the years after the upzoning, were attributed to the zoning change. Now, maybe some of them are. Definitely the Public Housing Agency is very supportive because now they can build differently on the sites they own. Makes it a lot easier for them. But what's really interesting about this is that, remember, the policy context here is New Zealand suddenly more than doubled population growth after a pretty lengthy economic slump after the financial crisis. And that same political and economic pressure that led to the Unitary Plan also led to the Kiwi Build and Auckland Housing Program that was launched in the same period. And the Auckland Housing Program is essentially a new public housing funded program to deliver 24,000 new homes in existing land holdings over 10 years. It's the largest residential build program to be undertaken in New Zealand for decades and will be fully funded. So we have this interesting thing that one paper's saying, oh, it's almost all upzoning, and then we have a policy of funding a rapid historical once-in-a-generation public housing build. So which is the main causal thing? I'm sure the zoning helped in some ways, was favourable to both public housing owners and additional private property owners. But now, of course, if the agency has to buy new sites, it's got to compete with other buyers as well. And from 2017 to 2025, they built 9,500 public homes in Auckland and 21,000 nationwide. So I don't know. This to me opens a really interesting question. Well, of course, Auckland had a much bigger public housing surge than other cities in the years after it announced an Auckland public housing program to build more public housing in Auckland than other cities. Like that should be the kind of context that we see that in. And of course, you can see that here. The top right one's probably interesting. That's Auckland. And the average of the donors is the red. And so you can see that it massively surged from 2016 onwards, right? Yeah. All right, Trent, I'll get to that as well. Okay, a couple more things, and then we'll get to the questions. Maybe we can skip this one, but there's another paper, of course. So we've got this huge story now of massive, massive changes in Auckland, transforming the price of housing. And another paper says, well, yeah, look, our model, our Alonso-Mills model, shows that we'll get a quarter increase in the floor space, 23%. And that would decrease, or dwelling prices would be 15 to 30% higher under the counterfactual. So again, it seems like we're cooperating all these things. But of course, this model here is just, kind of a toy spreadsheet unrelated to what's happening. And I think it's really important if you're into housing economics and Alonso-Mills is very popular. It is a model of the optimal density. It is not a model of the optimal rate of production per period of time, right? So I think we've got to kind of use the tools we have in a sensible way. And to illustrate, I always try and get people to think, if one developer who's, say, building 5 stories is allowed to build 10 stories, they're not extra homes per year. They're extra homes on that lot. Because all those people who bought those 5 extra stories of dwellings, they didn't buy the dwellings from some other project that would have got out of the ground. And so you gotta always keep in mind the right dimensions here. That you can have a slow rate of housing production. So here on the x-axis, on the left, it's a slow rate per period. So my little quadrants are like a 1-year period, and I've got a little diagram. You've got either 4 buildings in one tower or 4 detached homes. So you can have 4 per period at high density or low density, or you can have 8 per period at high density or low density. Right? The rate per period of time is not regulated by the density of the dwellings in the area. Okay? It's really important. So the Alonso-Mills model, wow, it looks like we're having all this extra stuff. That just tells me what the optimal density is if you choose to develop, or you might choose to wait. Some really interesting stuff as well. Last one, the Auckland chief economist, a couple of years ago, had a look at the census data that came out and compared 2018 to 2023 census, and they compared the rate of change of dwellings and the rate of change of population, right? And they said, oh, look at this. Among the authorities identified as Tier 1 urban areas, Auckland and Lower Hutt had the highest ratios of new dwellings per new person, as in the growth rate of dwellings relative to the growth rate of people was the highest, in the country. Okay. Oh, both have benefited from increased flexibility through changes in land policy. Great. Yeah, they have. What's really interesting here is that Wellington was wiped off the map here because it actually had a negative population growth. So on the left here is from the chief economist of Auckland. And the x-axis here is the change in usual resident population from between the census years, and the y-axis is the change in dwelling count. And so these dashed lines sort of show the ratio. So on the 45, you got 1 to 1. Here, you got 2 to 1. So Auckland, right, its population grew 5.5%. It had 12% more dwellings during that period. Right, that's good. It's the furthest counterclockwise of all the dwellings. Unfortunately, what's really interesting is if you add back Wellington on the right side, you can see Wellington slightly more counterclockwise than Auckland, right? Um, so, and then if you look at other cities, you've got London or San Francisco, you've got a lot of places that are apparently, NIMBY heartlands being more counterclockwise than Auckland. So the question is, well, does that really make sense for us? Does 5 years within a longer property cycle really tell us much information? I guess the point is, if you believed this analysis, you would say, well, Auckland and Lower Hutt should copy Wellington because they're further counterclockwise in their planning scheme. And no one says that, but that's what you'd have. If you believe this analysis provides information, that's what you would say. So in sum, what's the point here? Well, we should try and learn from these policy experiments, but we need to sense test the results, right? We really need to sense test them. If someone comes up to me and says, 5% change in the stock, I'm like, that is enormous when you only build a couple of percent per year, right? It's enormous. It is likely there are temporary adjustment effects on the rate of housing production because now we've changed the composition of housing types available, right? But how big are they and how long do they last? Well, I think they're smaller than what we've seen here. A doubling of the rate of production, a 35% higher rental counterfactual. What makes me also wonder how true this is that Auckland currently is debating whether they need even more upzoning, right? I don't know why everyone's not happy with this outcome if it's as large and effective as they say. So that's just about all from me. As Jane mentioned, in June in Brisbane, I'm running a bit of a workshop on housing economics in Brisbane. So if you're interested in some professional development, taking some time to really sit down and think about economics and housing coherently and in an interesting group with a lot of workshops, just Google Ground Rules Land and Housing Workshop online and jump on Eventbrite. There's a couple of weeks left for discounted early bird tickets. So thank you. I'm really keen to hear some questions.
Yeah, good one, Cam. That was great. I might just say a couple of things and we'll jump into the questions. I think what you've highlighted is just the challenges of drawing conclusions based on empirical data in the real world. I mean, the difficulty of establishing what the right counterfactual is. And I think we can't run controlled experiments in economics generally. And I mean, this is an example where we don't have a controlled experiment and we've got to try and do our best with the data to see if we can replicate an experiment to some extent. And I mean, you're never going to do that perfect. And I think you're asking the right questions. I mean, what I like about what you've done is you've really thought about what the analysis they've done, the data they've got, the decisions they've made, and I think that's the type of thing that economists should be doing. So we may as well get stuck in the questions. We've got two questions. We've got one from Pete first, and then we'll jump to Trent. So Pete's asked, question for later, both the counterfactuals about consents are saying the same thing with a counterfactual slowdown. Is there any reason to suggest why both are wrong and both wrong in the same direction?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess it's really interesting, right? Because one of the papers with not the synthetic control, but the other, with this sort of straight line extrapolation of the pre and post trends of inside and outside. In a follow-up paper, the authors shift the date of this trend, and they get completely different counterfactuals, obviously. And so the question really is, well, if you can just sort of arbitrarily draw these lines, one of them can't be right, yeah? Like, so if you, for example, believe the first paper, you get 22,000 extra dwellings from 2016 to 2021. If you believe the other paper, you get less than that in those periods and more than that in other periods. So I think, you know, we've really got to be careful about what we're doing. Yeah, I do find it interesting that both a sort of both get near the same sort of trends. And I do find it, I mean, I know why mechanically in the data that happens, because Taronga, one of the other donor cities in the synthetic control, saw a peak in 2016 and then fell, and it's 57% of the counterfactual, right? I know why it happens. I guess, and I know why the other one happens. And I mean, I know why everyone wants it to happen. And there's a lot of degrees of freedom in these studies to get that. Um, but yeah, it's an interesting observation. And I mean, I think it's of course true that consents were higher, and partly that's because you sort of needed more consents per net additional dwelling as well, right? So you're going to get that mechanically from the change in the composition. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I just find it odd, right? Like, um, if you know, let, let's give an example. Um, I might share my screen again if it's possible. More, share. Okay. If you saw this chart, right? Continue. With no line on it and just saw the grey top curve. It was all blank. And someone asked, there was a major policy shift that radically changed the slope of this line. When was it? You would not find it, right? You would not find it on this curved line here. You'd be like, oh, maybe here, maybe here, maybe here. I don't know. So to me, that says if we can't look at the result and work back and go, oh, this happened then we're sort of creating the break in our method. So I guess that's really all I've got to say. It is an interesting observation, though. Should I go on to Trent's?
Yes, yeah. So Trent has asked whether you've looked at this paper by Donovan and Maltman, and also he says he's wondering, wasn't Wellington excluded because it was also upzoned? So you've probably got a better idea of what Donovan and Maltman is than I do. So yeah, over to
I
you,
do. I'm
Jan.
not sure which paper, the Wellington upzoning exclusion. Do you mean from the donor cities of the synthetic control on either of them?
I'll just Trent, are you
That's the
there?
only one.
I can unmute you, and then you can hop in if you want to say something.
Hmm.
Oops. Uh, maybe I haven't been successful at that. Anyway,
Yeah, so I think he's referring to the synthetic control, one of them,
ah,
and why you'd exclude Wellington because it was also upzoned. I mean, like if you're going to do this, is again part of this degrees of freedom thing. Upzonings happen all the time, everywhere, in every city, on the quiet. And so if you're going to sort of pick one that you're unhappy with and go back through the back catalogue of zoning changes, you should probably do it with all of them. And of course, if you did that, you'd probably have nothing left to donate into the synthetic controlled donor pool. So I think, I'm not really, I mean, they do lots of tests on this, right? They exclude certain cities. They test for Australian cities as the donor pool instead of New Zealand cities. But, this just highlights the issue, right? You can look at a chart of Sydney or Vancouver or Toronto, and it looks exactly like the Auckland consents chart with a boom. And they would tell lots of stories as well about whether it was some zoning or other, or not zoning, or it would have been higher otherwise. So I think it's just really tricky. Um, I've got are the slides still up?
Uh,
Or am
no,
I
I think,
just
can you,
try again? Hang on. I think he means to do the donors, these ones here. Is that what's up? No, I can't see the chat. Chat, where are you? I think it was the latter.
it was a graph. So,
Oh, do you mean this thing here? Keeping Wellington out of this one. So I've contacted the authors of this, and I've explained, you've left Wellington out because it's further counterclockwise than Auckland. And they said, yeah, well, because it had negative population growth, you get a negative ratio and it doesn't make sense. So we excluded it. Like, what do you mean it doesn't make sense? If people are leaving the city and you've built 5% new dwellings, that's like amazing, right? That's an amazing result. You're still building when no one even wants to live there. So I don't know why they did it. That was their reason. Never seemed to make sense to me, but that was the one. In terms of the Maltman Stu Donovan paper, I mean, look, there's a lot of words in that paper. I'll give them that, and there's a lot of confusion about. Well, I mean, we've had lots of back and forth with them about that, and earlier this one. This one here, perhaps. We've had a lot of back and forth with Stu and Matt, but they sort of they have a story. It's coherent because all the papers add up and are consistent with each other in their mind. And we'll probably be writing a reply to that paper in the next little while. I don't know exactly what's wrong with this chart. Exactly. This chart also really upsets people too, but I think it really illustrates the point that if you're trying to isolate policy effects, you've got to understand there was a massive change in population growth, and these are the two biggest areas. So you sort of get similar trends. Auckland Council versus Wellington Region. I don't know what that means.
well, I guess it's a question of
Wellington zoning region also includes upzoning. Yeah, in 2022 or 3, the upzoning in the Lower Hutt, which is in the Wellington region, right, which is way up here. So I'm not sure that makes a lot of sense. Look, I'm just looking at the data, trying to sense check whether it's consistent, right? Like if the Gold Coast fell in rents, by 35%, people would move from Brisbane to the Gold Coast, right? It couldn't just stay like that. And yet, when you have these large effects, you got to ask, how do they stay there if the quality of life or the opportunities are the same? Because people will shift for a third of the rent per week. You're talking hundreds of bucks per week. You're talking $10,000 plus of after-tax income per year to just relocate into the Auckland Council from the neighbouring council. So I think it's important. Lower Hutt was upzoned in 2017. I have to check which zoning change you mean by that. Yeah, there's, as I say, all the counterfactuals have lots of different upzonings happening all the time. Planners have full-time jobs. This is what they do. Sydney and well, yeah, I would say the Patrick's point is that for example, the Melbourne-Sydney rental shift is a quality of life shift. So it can be sustained while the quality of life difference is sustained. And you can see that because people are migrating out of Melbourne, for example. Whereas what you've got now is people migrating out of Auckland when the rents are apparently super cheap and easy. So that's why I ask the question, is this really coherent with what we know about economics?
But I think we've got another question from Steve, but the comment I'd make, Cam, is that, I mean, Melbourne has had a lot of construction relative to population growth, hasn't it? I mean, or the gap is lower than in other places. Like they've actually, like if you look at where the dwelling construction's occurred versus population growth in Australia, I think Melbourne's one of the places where it's more favourable. Whereas in Brisbane, we've had all of this population growth and, proportionally not as much dwelling construction.
Uh, yeah, we have in the last couple of years. We have, yeah, yeah. But I mean, Melbourne rents and prices boomed in the second half of the 2010s when they were falling in Sydney and Brisbane, and they still had more construction than we
Mm,
did, right? So like, it's very hard to just pick a period within a long property
mm,
cycle where different cities are doing different things, and I guess that's part of my point, right? You can pick, the Austin's Texas story is going viral online. That look, they're building all this stuff and rents are falling. I'm like, yeah, yeah, because they just had a boom and a bust where rents went up more than any other place in the whole country, and then they built a bunch of houses in response. Um, and it's quite interesting if you compare the what are called regional price parities, which are what the BLS uses to compare the cost of rent in the CPI between different regions in the US. What you find is that Austin, relative to other cities, has been growing and continues to grow, while places like San Francisco have been falling for 10 years. So the question is, yeah, of course, after a boom, you get a correction. But if you zoom out, it costs more to rent in Austin relative to San Francisco, for example, now than it has for more forever, basically. Um, so you kind of got to zoom out because property markets have relatively slow cycles, and
mm.
New Zealand's in one of those cycles right now. Right, they've had a recession for a few years, so we'll see what happens next there.
Yep. Okay, we've got a question from Steve, and then I'll ask one after that. So Steve's question is: did the 2016 Auckland Unity Plan include an increase in developer contributions or betterment levy or similar?
Not that I
Okay, so
know of, no.
yeah, I hadn't heard of that, so
No.
doesn't look like it. I guess, Cam, what I would like to know is, I mean, what do you think? What does this mean for policy? Because upzoning is seen as a way to help boost the supply of housing. I mean, regardless of
Mm.
what the empirical data. I mean, it's. I think I tend to agree. Look, it's difficult to make a strong case based on Auckland for the reasons that you've outlined. Uh, but we know that we do need more supply, and isn't this a way of getting additional supply? How do you think of upzoning as a policy choice?
Look, I think for me, I mean, I'm happy. We should be updating zoning regularly,
Mm,
right? And we do. What the planners call it strategic planning. Basically, go and see what communities want, where we can put stuff, and keep people happy. So we should be doing that quite regularly, and I'm very content with it. And we should shape our cities with zoning, allowing more stuff in different places. That's totally fine. But again, that's a location dimension and density is a density dimension, but the quantity per period is choice of the market, right? Um, and so it's been very hard. Look, I've read just about everything I could find from the last 200 years of how to get faster housing production. Because, of course, in the 1870s, the biggest problem in Europe in the industrial cities was the shortage of housing,
mm,
right? In the 1880s boom in Victoria, the shortage of housing. In the 1920s and 30s, the shortage of housing. Um, every cycle, we get this. And the answer is, well, do we really want more? Because if we have a bust, and we're like Spain after the financial crisis, right? We might just be bulldozing them or leaving them empty. So either we kind of trust the market to work it out, or we kind of don't. And if we don't, then I'm happy to build non-market housing anywhere you want, of any style you want, anytime. But I really wish there was some policy lever to orchestrate a rapid push to capital investment in housing. And I don't know how. I mean, it's build to order. You build new units when people buy them, and you wait when they don't. And that's what we've had for hundreds of years. And I do expect, like Canada, which had a shortage until 6 months ago, that maybe that result will be true here. here as well, that suddenly we'll stop having a shortage and our next big problem will be prices are coming down and no one wants to build.
I mean, that's associated with lower population growth, isn't it? Because they had a sharp decline in immigration. So that's one of the other questions in this debate. To what extent should we be? I mean, is the quicker way to do this to actually look at the demand side and to reduce the rate of immigration, for example?
Well, I think the effect's temporary as well. You can certainly just close the border if you want.
Mm.
Like Canada's had negative migration because they're not renewing temporary resident permits. And so people have having the 7% of residents who are temporary, many of them have had to start leaving and not be replaced by other temporary residents. And you can certainly do that. And what you'll find is everyone stops building. I think Toronto just reported the first quarter with no new apartment projects released for 35 years. No new apartments this quarter in Toronto. So you can do that, but I actually think, again, the effect is temporary. Maybe it lasts 4 or 5 years. And then we've stopped building, and then eventually we get to the price equilibrium again with fewer homes and fewer people. In Australia, we had pretty rapid population growth all through the 2010s, which ramped up in 2006-7 sort of period.
Mm.
The second half of the 2010s, rents and prices were falling in most cities for 5 years till sort of the end of the COVID lockdown. So it really was one of the cheapest times to buy a house in Australia at the end of the 2010s in most capital cities. So the question for me is always, well, hang on, if you're blaming planning now for the boom, are we also crediting planning for having the cheapest rents and prices in 20 years just before COVID? Right, like which is it? Should we give them a pat on the back then? And if we have another correction, what's the story we tell?
Yep. Okay. A good one, Cam. Well done. And I think we'll leave it there. And what I'll do is I'll send out a link to I'll put this recording online for people who registered because it looks like, I mean, it's good the people who came attended. Thanks for coming. There are a few more I know who are interested, so I'll send that around. But yeah, Cam, good work. I think that's a good example of how economists should analyse data, and these are important policy issues. And yeah, you've made a really important contribution to these debates. So yeah, really thank you for your contribution today, and yeah, look forward to your future contributions. So yeah,
Thanks for having me, June. Thanks everyone for coming. I hope you got some value.
Good one. Thanks, guys.